Hello and welcome to the Heaven Bound Sunday School class at the First General Baptist Church in Truman, Arkansas. Our lesson today about another prophet from the Old Testament, Isaiah. We'll be reading from Isaiah 53, and we'll read that scripture in just a moment. But Isaiah, as I said, another one of the prophets that we've been studying about this quarter. Isaiah, I'm not going to say he's the most popular prophet, but probably the better way of saying it, he's one of the most well-known prophets. I think if anybody has asked to list 2 or 3 prophets, Isaiah, I think, is always going to show up in everyone's list. He prophesied during a time that was a dismal time for God's people. But Isaiah was up to the challenge. And to show you the significance of the book of Isaiah, there's 5 dozen references to Isaiah in the New Testament. But Isaiah spoke of a time when Jerusalem would be destroyed by the Babylonians. But he also told the people that there would be restoration of Jerusalem, and it would be led by Cyrus. And this did come to pass, as Isaiah had prophesied. But Isaiah also looked far into the future to someone far greater than Cyrus, and that, of course, is Jesus. In the opening focus in our Sunday school book, I'm going to read one paragraph. It says, "Our lesson brings us to a case of suffering unlike any other. It tells of one God called my righteous servant. This one was both exalted and despised. He was oppressed and afflicted. He took the punishment for the sins of others so they could escape the punishment they deserved." In Isaiah, there's 4 passages that are commonly called the servant songs. And our lesson today comes from the 4th song in Isaiah. And that servant song is quoted 7 times in the New Testament. And we'll read the scripture now, as I said, 53rd chapter of Isaiah, starting with verse 4. "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities." Now, out of a study Bible that I have, I want to talk briefly about verse 4. And what this particular writer wrote. He says, "In keeping with how suffering was often viewed in biblical times, those who witnessed the servant's suffering saw it as a punishment by God. The servant was deemed to be bearing the pain and suffering associated with his own sinful actions. No one would assume that he was suffering on account of the wrongdoings of others. Followers of Jesus can readily see these words as a compelling description of Jesus' suffering on the cross. Those who mocked him there voiced their belief that God had abandoned him, that he was punished, stricken, and afflicted." And if you remember during the crucifixion, as Jesus was there on the cross, some of the Roman soldiers and some of the people that were there mocked Jesus and said things, and I'm paraphrasing, that, if you're the Son of God, why doesn't he save you? If you are Jesus, why can't you come down from that cross? Why can't you make this all go away? But for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. And the significance there in verse 5, he talks about our transgressions and our iniquities. And further on it says, by his wounds we are healed. He did that for us. Goes on to say in verse 6, he says, we all, and that's repeated, we're like sheep and we've gone astray, and each of us has turned to our own way. Everyone has sinned, and like the sheep that goes off, sometimes they get lost and they never come back. Our lesson writer says, we have turned to our own way, a selfish, sinful way. And I think that's a good description of the lives that many of us lead. It says, a lost sheep dies in the desert unless it is found and reclaimed. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. We were destined to die for our living in sin. However, according to God's plan, Jesus took upon himself all of our sin and all of its punishment. He accepted the death we deserved and made us free to live forever. It says he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. He goes on to say, so he did not open his mouth. Silence from Jesus during his trial. He didn't offer any kind of defense. And during all of these farce of a proceeding, Jesus didn't speak. But we know he did a lot of speaking prior to that. He spoke when he healed the sick. He spoke when he raised the dead. He spoke when he calmed the storms. And he spoke when he worked miracles. Jesus was not silent when others were being harmed. Scripture tells us as he was led away by oppression and judgment, it says, yet who of his generation protested? He had been denied a fair hearing by the authorities. They were the ones oppressing him. He had no judgment. But yet who of his generation protested? We can look in Luke 23:21. But they cried, saying, crucify him, crucify him. No one was saying, save him. It was, crucify him, crucify him. He was like an innocent man. He had been convicted and treated like a notorious criminal, yet he had never committed any violent act. So he is there with the wicked and put on a cross there between two criminals. It says he was assigned a grave with the wicked. In those times, anyone that was crucified, and that's the way they carried out their death penalty, usually they were all buried in a common grave. And I think that's what Isaiah is saying. He's going to be assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. But where was he buried? He was buried in a rich man's tomb. Remember Joseph of Arimathea? He came along and asked permission to lay Jesus' body in his tomb. It says, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. We talk many times in today's society about people being innocent, yet still being punished. And I think this was the ultimate act in that situation. Yet we find in verse 10, it was the Lord's will that this was to happen. It was God's plan. I'm going to read something here. It says, Jesus was able to look at the suffering he went through and know that he did indeed accomplish the work given to him. Hebrews 12:2 says that for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Just as we cannot begin to understand the depth of Jesus' suffering at the cross, We cannot imagine the joy that he felt after he uttered the words, "It is finished." Now earlier we talked about, like sheep, we go astray, lead a sinful life. So I'm going to conclude by asking this: have you given your life to Jesus Christ? You know, Jesus is the Good Shepherd. Or are you still going your own way like a wandering sheep?